To land my software engineering offer at CrowdStrike, I had to beat out 1,500 applicants on LinkedIn, the 30 or so that made it past the recruiter call to the hiring manager, and then after 3 more rounds, finally it came down to 2 applicants, and then I was the one who got the offer. And the software engineer who was part of the interview process told me that at that point it had basically come down to vibes, not technical skills. So in this video, I'm gonna break down what that means, how I prep for interviews, and what I think makes a difference when closing the offer. And before I dive into any of my advice, what I will say is that this video is not gonna focus on LeetCode at all, really. I think that it's a super overrated skill. 90% of the CS students that you're competing with can do LeetCode mediums. And that's kind of like the barrier to entry nowadays. It has nothing to do with like making you stand out. And so what I'm going to do is focus on what you can stand out on, and that is the behavioral side of things, how you're coming across, how you're speaking, and how to actually close the offer when you're competing with, 2 or 3 people that probably just nailed the LeetCode the same as you, and now you're having to beat them out. So the first topic that I want to go over is literally just speaking. And what's funny is I thought personally I would never have to work on that because I've always been somebody who's talked super fast and been super talkative in friend groups. But what I found is that unfortunately it does not correlate to interviews at all. And the reason there's no correlation is because if you think about it, look at all these interview questions. Like, when's the last time somebody that you've met in real life or socialized with asked you, tell me about yourself? Or what's the hardest project you've ever worked on? Or what's your weakness? People in social settings do not ask these very direct, strange questions. And so I realized that no matter how good I thought I was at speaking, I had no reps in when it came to answering these questions out loud. It's great that I could, sit down and write a paragraph answer, but unfortunately, the way you write paragraphs and the ways that those sound when you read it out loud are pretty terrible. And so the only way to improve is to just speak out loud. And I'm gonna go over that process right now. What I did to do this was I first asked ChatGPT for the top 25 hardest behavioral questions known to mankind. And once I had that list, I then started my process of practicing those verbally. And so I literally kept it simple. I just had my iPhone in my hand with all the questions that I could scroll through, and I would walk around the room, walk around the house, whatever, and just practice speaking into the void my answers. And what I found was my first take was almost never coherent. I would always have pauses, freezes, I would stutter, or I would basically go on tangents because I would have no idea where I was going with my answer. But practicing it out loud until I got a coherent verbal answer to the question was super critical when it came to coming across natural during my interviews for sure. And not only would I come up with what I thought was a coherent verbal answer, I would then paste that audio file into ChatGPT or just speak into the ChatGPT mic directly and ask it to analyze how I came across and if there's any flaws and if it was a strong answer. I would take that feedback, I wouldn't memorize anything that ChatGPT told me, and then I would just go again and again and again until I thought I had a really smooth, clean answer to any question that they could throw at me. And the key thing here is to remember you are not trying to memorize the question and you are not trying to memorize the answer. You are simply trying to practice speaking about topics that you normally would have never talked about in your entire life. And so that way when you're interviewing, you can come across as supernatural as if you are just in a natural conversation, and these are things that you've heard before. Next, I want to kind of go over your vibe during the interview, which is also extremely, extremely important when it comes to actually getting the offer. And I think the key thing here is to take the interviewer off of a pedestal. Oftentimes what's going to happen is, you're going to be interviewing with a staff engineer or a senior engineer, right? And they might have a lot of experience. They might have worked at Google, Microsoft, whatever. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, they're trying to get to know you, and they need to see that you'd be fun to work with, that you'd be a great teammate, right? And so if you're trying to be too respectful, overly polite, not being your true self, they're going to sense that. And I think it just creates a very weird vibe between the interview that seems very performative almost, just going through the motions. And nobody wants to do that, right? You want them to have fun during the interview and walk away thinking, hey, that guy was great to talk to, I would love to have another round of interviews with him or maybe work with him in the future. And for me, what this meant was that I just pretty much stopped overthinking my answers so much. I used to think that, I talk way too fast. It sounds like I just took an Adderall, so maybe I need to slow it down so they understand me better. Or maybe there's a joke that I wanted to make, kind of self-deprecating humor during the interview that I thought would be funny. But I would just bite my tongue because, I thought it wasn't professional at all to make a joke in an interview, or pretty much anything that I thought was not considered extremely polite and extremely professional, I wouldn't say. And I think that was really hurting me because who wants to work with somebody like that? And so in summary, I think taking them off of a pedestal will just let your true personality come through. And that's really key to sounding very natural and confident. And one more thing I forgot to mention about kind of my whole taking the interviewer off of the pedestal advice is that I actually have a kind of pre-game routine that I do before every round of interviews. And so it might sound silly to some, but it worked for me, and maybe it'll work for somebody else. So what I did was I always gave myself 1 hour before the interview to, stop reading LeetCode questions, stop reading my resume, stop prepping questions, and just, relax. And so I put on my headphones, I played my favorite music, I'd walk around, basically just vibing and trying to get myself in a good mood so that when I go into the interview, I'm super calm, super collected, and feeling really confident to nail all the questions. So now that we've covered speaking and your vibe during the interview, what I want to go over next is the biggest mistake I think people make when answering technical questions. And I'm not talking about LeetCode. When the interviewer asks you, even if they're super technical, like maybe they're staff engineer or a PM, right? And they know theoretically all of the stack and all the languages that you're talking about, I still think it's a huge mistake to go way too deep. And so I'm gonna give an example of a bad answer that I might have given before I learned all this stuff. So a bad answer would be, yeah, so I was working on the warehouse management system for X e-commerce company. And what I did was I worked on the front end using Angular and Tailwind. And on the back end, I was writing the back end scripts, and I was dealing with DTOs and repositories and controllers. And then I was kind of shaping the data of the back end, like the boxes and the units, and then feeding that into the database and then syncing all of that. And then you just want to tangent about a bunch of BS, basically like about lines of code and libraries that you're using, which first off, they don't even know what that stuff is most likely, because why would they know that? Even if they're a senior engineer, they're working on their own stack. And then second of all, who needs to know that? You need to stay way higher level. And then when asked, or if it seems relevant, then you can bring up the more technical specifications. So a better answer would be, yeah, I work on the warehouse management system, the little screen that you see on the little scanners in the warehouse. And so that deals with thousands of transactions a day. I get to work on the front end, which is really cool because all the warehouse workers, hundreds of them get to see it every day and use it. And then also it's really cool that I get to manage, thousands of shipments on the back end. And so I get to write scripts kind of detailing how box A goes from the shipping yard out to the customer or from returns back to the warehouse. And so right there, you kind of showed that you enjoy what you work on, you understand the flow end to end, and that you touch, a lot of customer facing stuff or useful things at the company. And that's way more valuable than telling them the libraries that you're using and like the structure of the data and all this stuff that's really useless. And lastly, I want to go over a story that highlights exactly why I think people need to stop focusing so much on LeetCode and really make sure that they're nailing behaviorals as well. And so I had referred my friend to a software engineering role at my company, and he nailed the technical, right? Like just got the medium down perfectly to move on to the next final round, which is purely behavioral with the VP of engineering. And the VP asked him something along the lines of, what's your greatest weakness? And my friend basically said something kind of like, I work too hard, which you might think, oh, that's not the worst answer in the world, but it comes off as a little cliche, or if you're stating it as a weakness, it's almost like you don't want to work as much, even if you say you're a hard worker. And that basically sank him. Like I remember the VP told my manager, never hire that guy. And we were, my manager told me that, months later after the interview rounds. And so that really shows you can nail a technical. There could be 3 people rooting for you because, wow, that guy did so great in the LeetCode medium. But if you, take one bad behavioral question or you say something off, then that could really sink you and could be the difference between you getting the offer versus the other guy. And so I think it's really important to, yes, you need the baseline LeetCode skills. You have to be able to do any medium given to you, but you also need to be extremely good at behavioral questions and making them like you. I hope this video was helpful and gave some insight into the interview process and kind of demystifying the whole idea of like getting the final offer, and that it does come down to vibes at the end of the day. Let me know if you want me to cover anything else or if you have any questions in the comments. Thanks for watching.